Globe Theatre is one of the most famous theatres in the world. The Globe Theatre was first built in 1599 by the company Lord Chamberlain's men. This was the company which was part owned by the famous William Shakespeare. The Globe was where Shakespeare unveiled his first performance of his now most famous work revealed to the public. This included works like Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, Hamlet, and of course the infamous Macbeth.
When Shakespeare wrote plays for the Globe, he wrote with his audience in mind. He wrote the scene of violence and comedy within his plays that would appeal to the lower class audience. For example, in the play Macbeth, Shakespeare wrote about a violent siege on King Duncan's castle. However, within this violent siege, he mixed in bits of comedy to it, such as the scene where one of the soldiers looks at a young boy and delivers the line, "What, you egg?" before stabbing him. While he would also write to appeal to lower classes, he would also write about scenes about life, death, and love for members of the upper class of nobility that valued intellectual dialogue.
The Globe has housed some of the most famous performances of theater at the time, but why was the Globe created in the first place? Let's go back in time to what theater was like during the Elizabethan era. The Globe was created during the Elizabethan era of theater. This era was considered the golden age of English theater, and the era coincided with the reign of Queen Elizabeth I from 1558 to 1603. This era was considered a golden age due to a number of reasons. One of them was the rise of patronage. Patronage was where wealthy and influential individuals would support theater companies and individual playwrights. This financial support allowed for the creations of new plays and the development of innovative theater techniques. There was also a largely growing popular demand for entertainment among the general public. Since the Elizabethan era was a time of relative political stability, this allowed for a massive growth of the arts. With Queen Elizabeth I on the throne, there was a sense of national pride and integrity. Theater became a great way to celebrate English culture. Some of the most famous playwrights emerged during this era, including William Shakespeare, as mentioned earlier, Christopher Marlowe,
who was responsible for plays such as Tamburlaine the Great and Dr. Faustus,
and Ben Jonson,
responsible for plays such as Every Man in His Humor and Bartholomew Fair.
During the time of Queen Elizabeth I's rule, the Protestant Church had heavy influences over public opinion in England. The Church viewed theater arts as immoral and corrupting, and believed that plays would lead people to commit sin. As a result, in 1572, Elizabeth I ruled that actors who performed in public without being hired from a noble person would be deemed criminal under the Vagabond Act. These criminals were punished harshly, with the threat of being branded and thrown into slavery. Because of such harsh rules, acting companies in London had a very difficult time to put on shows. Therefore, theaters were built in the areas outside the city limits. Before long, the Globe ended up being built alongside of the other theaters, such as the Curtain, the Rose, and the Swan. What type of acting was in the Globe? At the time, the acting experience was very unique. All the actors were male and would play both male and female characters, with the younger boys being used to play female characters. As mentioned before, acting companies required to be sponsored by a person of nobility. So whenever a play was to be put on, the actors would be allowed to wear clothes of nobility, but were only allowed to wear them within the theater. This added to the spectacles of the performances, where the actors would wear elaborate outfits and have detailed set pieces. The actors were also very pronounced in the way that they spoke their lines. Their acting was very robust, and their voices carried to a wide audience in the theaters. They especially had to be louder, often declaring lines of dialogue to the audience, since they did not have microphones. The theaters were also tightly packed, and members of the audience would often yell and make noise during the performances. Speaking of the audiences, let's review what it was like to be in the Globe at the time. The Globe was divided into 3 separate floors that differed in experiences and price. The first floor was the ground floor, and by that I mean it was literally the ground. There were no seats, and the audience would have to clump together on the floor to watch a performance. Anything was allowed on this floor. People could eat and drink during the performance, or even yell and interact with the actors on stage, if they would find the performance to be boring. The fee to get into the ground floor was next to nothing, meaning anyone could get into the theater to see the show. While this opened up a big opportunity for people of all classes to experience theater and listen to the stories of some of the greatest playwrights, pickpockets would enter the Globe to steal from the patrons. The entirety of the Globe was an open-air theater, meaning that those on the ground floor had to deal with weather conditions. The entire theater was also an open-air theater, meaning those on the ground floor had to deal with the weather conditions, as umbrellas were not allowed in the theater. The upper levels costed more to get into and were typically reserved for members of nobility to comfortably view a play. All plays that were presented in the Globe had to be presented during the day where natural light entered the theater. They were unable to be present during the night, as the amount of candles needed to light up the theater for every performance would have been very costly. The tight, compact nature of the ground floor meant it would also be a fire hazard. The Globe has housed many famous performances. Famous not only for showing the first performances of many famous plays, but famous for the amount of accidents during a performance. For example, during the first performance of Macbeth at the Globe, there had been an excessive amount of unfortunate events. Shakespeare himself was said to have acted in this production to fill in a missing role. This was because the actor who was supposed to play Lady Macbeth fell ill and died suddenly before the performance. Surprisingly, this was not the only death surrounding this performance, as another actor was stabbed to death on stage with a real dagger when portraying the murder of King Duncan. Another, more explosive example was when, on June 1613, a theatrical cannon misfired during a performance of Henry VIII and set fire to the roof of the Globe. Under an hour, the entire theater burnt down with only one casualty, a man whose pants caught on fire, and he attempted to put out the flames with a bottle of ale. The theater was quickly rebuilt, with the new Globe opening in 1614. This time, however, the roof was tiled rather than thatched to prevent another fire. The new Globe continued to be a popular venue for performances for several years. In 1642, however, the Puritans who had come into power in England closed all theaters, including the Globe. The theater was dismantled and the land was turned over to housing development. It wasn't until 1997, hundreds of years later, that a new Globe Theater was built, only a few hundred feet from the site of the original Globe. The new Globe was designed to be authentic as possible, using the same materials and techniques that were used to build the original. Today, the Globe is a popular tourist attraction and performance venue where productions of Shakespeare's plays performed in the open-air theater during the summer months. The Globe has a storied history that stands fascinating to this day. With such a record of famous performances within its halls, bearing present to members of all social classes, and still carrying on traditional theater performances hundreds of years after it was shut down, the Globe has its mark in history as one of the greatest monuments to theater.